Hey guys, it's Kelsey, your best friend on the homestead from roughandtumblefarmhouse.com. You have probably seen everywhere people water glassing eggs. It got really popular in the last maybe 2 years or so. It's on YouTube, it's on Instagram, it's on TikTok as a way of preserving the life of your eggs. Now, this is a preservation method that I have actually decided not to use for my eggs, and I'm going to tell you why. Now, I also saw all the videos about this. It was maybe a year, 2 years ago tops, where this was just kind of everywhere as a way to extend the shelf life of your eggs without having to refrigerate them. And it would extend them for 1 to even 2 years, which just sounds pretty incredible, right? So I actually went and got some lime because I just kind of looked up the recipe quick and thought, okay, sure, next time I'm at Fleet Farm, I'll just grab some bags of pickling lime. We can make this happen. Well, then when I came home and then started doing some more research on it, I determined that there are definitely better ways that I think are a little more food safe for preserving your eggs. So first of all, let's back up. What even is water glassing eggs? So to water glass eggs, you're taking pickling lime, which is calcium hydroxide, pretty sure. You're mixing it with water, and then you take clean eggs. They have to be clean eggs that have not been washed, so they still have their protective bloom coating. Because eggs, when they come out of a chicken just has kind of one tube that everything's coming down. So poop, pee is all kind of mixed together in a mush. Eggs come down the same thing. So eggs, as they're developed, they have this protective coating. So as they come out, they aren't getting covered in bacteria, hopefully from the digestive tract of the chicken. You take those eggs, your very nice clean eggs you've collected from your coop, and you put them into this solution. You normally have like a jar. I'm sorry I can't show you this because I'm not actually going to do it. So I don't have footage of how to do this, but a lot of people have videos of it if you're curious. But you take, usually people use like a half-gallon glass jar or a big food safe, container of some kind. They mix the solution in it, and then you just carefully set all your eggs into that solution. And then you put it on a shelf somewhere out of direct sunlight. And then when you want to use the eggs, you take them out and you wash them off really thoroughly, because the pickling lime, just like if you've ever used it for making pickles, you have to rinse cucumbers multiple times to make sure that is all off of there, because number one, it does not taste very good, and number two, it's not very good for you to ingest a lot of this pickling lime. So that is sort of the process of water glassing eggs. So let's talk about why I've decided I don't want to do it. What the thinking is behind this, and the reasoning behind this is of doing this process, is that eggs are porous. They have tons of little pores, just like your nose and face on them. And the pores are there to allow oxygen to get into the egg for chicks as they develop. They actually need to take in that oxygen to breathe and develop. And so the idea is that this solution seals up all the pores on the egg so oxygen can't get in, and a little bit of moisture that would kind of come out of the egg, a little bit of evaporation kind of coming out, can't happen. And so that keeps the eggs in like an ever fresh kind of state, or really extends the amount of time they're going to be fresh by sealing up those pores. And before I go any further, I do want to say I'm not making this video to kind of shame anybody or say you absolutely shouldn't do this. I just have noticed that the majority of blog posts, the majority of content around this topic, everybody is saying that this is perfectly safe. No one talks at all about any of the sort of food risks that you should be aware of before you do something like this. I'm a little bit of a canning stickler. You're not going to find me on rebel canning groups and things like that. I have a university extension background, is where I used to work for 4 years. And so I'm the sort of person who believes in a good, safe food science and following canning protocols and things like that. And so that is why this has not fallen into that for me. But if it's something you've decided for your own family that you're comfortable with it, or you've done it a lot and you've had great success, it's absolutely an individual choice. It's just not the choice that I'm making. So I just want to make sure people have the resources out there so they can make an informed decision, as opposed to just having nothing but this is great, this is fine, you should do this. This is an ancient method or old method from the 1800s of doing this, when today we do have more options at our fingertips if we want to use them. And we do know more as well about food safety and food science. Okay, let's talk now about the risks that I kind of mentioned. So one of the things that we already talked about, of course, is that eggs are porous, and so things can get into the shell. And so that does not exclude this solution being able to not just only seal up the shell, but actually permeate through the shell. And there's an inner membrane in an egg. and get into the eggs themselves. And so this, of course, would make the eggs taste pretty awful. It would make them be not very good for you. It would kind of defeat the purpose that you're trying to achieve of preserving the egg, because it's going to make your egg really nasty. Now, this doesn't always happen. It happens sometimes. So I'm not saying it's a guarantee that this will happen to your eggs, that it will get through there, but the bloom on an egg isn't always all the way complete. And even if you've checked out the egg and it looks good to you before you put it into the solution, it doesn't mean that this isn't a possibility that that solution is going to get into your eggs and make them pretty nasty. The next two big things to talk about are the risks of salmonella and botulism. And now this, to be fair, is a risk with eggs in general. You hear about salmonella being a problem because these are things that are kind of just naturally occurring in the world that can get into your food source, and including your eggs. Even eggs you're not water glassing can be exposed to this, but water glassing kind of increases the risk of that being an issue. So let's talk first about salmonella. So salmonella is a bacteria that can get into your eggs from the chicken itself. So we used to think that salmonella was something that got on your eggs, but now we know that salmonella exists, or can exist, not always, but can exist naturally inside of a chicken. And so the egg, when it comes out of the chicken, already has the salmonella bacteria inside of it. And so again, that's something, I honestly, I'm not sure how you test to see if your chickens are exposed to salmonella or have it in their systems. I'm assuming there's some sort of fecal test you could do. Now salmonella, like other bacteria, if it is in a cooled environment, like a refrigerator, for example, that bacteria is not going to be able to populate and grow as much as it would in a room temperature environment, like you would have with water glassed eggs. So again, salmonella is a risk no matter what, but if you aren't having those eggs cooled and you just have it on the shelf, if there is salmonella in an egg, the amount of salmonella bacteria in that egg is going to be exponentially greater than one that you had just in your fridge. So if you were to eat that egg, your exposure would be a lot higher. The next thing to talk about is botulism. So botulism is probably the most commonly known big baddie in sort of the food preservation world. Botulism is something that it can exist naturally in soils. It's something that can be in fecal matter. It can be in all sorts of places. And so it's something that can get onto the surface of your egg. Now, of course, if you're doing this process properly, you are hopefully using, of course, the cleanest eggs in the process. But that doesn't mean that you might not have the botulism bacteria on the egg in some way, shape, or form. And then if you again had just a regular egg, botulism is a risk for all eggs, not just these ones, but if you had botulism on the surface of, say, one egg, and that egg goes into a carton, and then that carton goes in the fridge, for example, or even sits on your counter for a couple weeks, it's contained to that egg, versus if you have all these eggs in a water glass situation, the botulism bacteria can survive very well at room temperature, and it can survive very well in a non-acidic environment. And pickling lime is a base solution that's kind of going back to like 7th grade science class, but it is very much not acidic. So if there is botulism somehow on an egg, you have now put that egg in with a bunch of other eggs in a container in like the perfect conditions for it to grow. So that is why botulism, again, a risk for all eggs, but you're really increasing the risk by preserving your eggs in this way. Another reason, aside from kind of those general food risks, which we'll talk about sort of the chances of them happening here in a little bit, another thing is that I'm in a bunch of, homesteading groups on Facebook and some communities and things like that. And I usually read about water glassing eggs when people ask questions or post about them. And it seems like in the comment section, it's always like 50-50 whether or not it worked really well or if it really didn't work very well. And then there's always a bunch of people in there too that are just too nervous about whether or not it really is safe or not, and so they do the process and they're too scared to eat the eggs. And so I don't want to be in a situation where I go to all the work to do this and it doesn't work, when I know that there are methods that are going to work and I know what the results will be pretty much guaranteed. And so I also don't want to put myself in a position, it's sort of like when you're picking mushrooms, like you never want to be not sure, like you really want to be sure with that mushroom. So for some people, it turns out it's just not worth the gamble. Once they come to it, they don't want to take that risk. Another reason why I don't like this method is that if an egg cracks or breaks inside your container, it ruins the whole batch. It is officially contaminated and you have to throw it out. If you check out other bloggers who've talked about this before, they will all say that too, that if an egg has a crack in there and you don't know how long ago the crack happened, that it can contaminate the batch. And that also, I think, would be really suspicious and hard if you're, taking an egg out to use and your solution hasn't changed color too much or anything, but there still could be an egg in there that got cracked that you just haven't gotten to that cracked egg yet, so I'm not comfortable with it, obviously, since I'm making this video. But so, and not comfortable too with the fact that you could lose, depending on how many dozens of eggs you have in this jar, because one egg, the shell wasn't quite as sturdy as the others, it could crack and you lose all your eggs. I mean, what a waste. It's just be such a bummer. So I don't like that either, that you're literally really putting all your eggs in one basket or jug or whatever you have them in. Of course, I am talking about here food safety and foodborne illnesses and things like that, which of course, for the most part, the percentages, the chances of these things happening is very small. Even with water glassing, I'm sure the percentages, I'm not sure that anyone's actually calculated out what the risk of you getting one of these diseases is, but I'm sure it's a very small percentage. But when it comes to food safety things and canning protocols and things like that, a lot of people will say, oh, it's such a small chance. It's like a less than 1% chance. What's that even matter? Well, I like to tell people a brief personal story that I've had 3 pregnancies and 3 babies. I've been very lucky. My first pregnancy and baby, perfectly fine, no issues after the fact. My second one, my daughter, I ended up having a pretty severe umbilical hernia from that. And I looked it up after, and the chances of getting an umbilical hernia from pregnancy is a 0.08%. It's a less than 1% chance of getting an umbilical hernia, and I still have it. It's going to involve like serious surgery to get it fixed. My third baby, I was perfectly fine, but he had something called transient tachypnea, which is like a fluid in the lung situation, and it is a less than 2% chance of that happening. So here I am, 3 babies, 2 out of 3 of the times that I have had children, I have had something happen where it was a less than 2% chance of it happening. And so I know when you talk about statistics and chance, I'm not trying to fearmonger at all, but if you have better ways of doing something that are for sure going to be safe, that is just the route that I'm comfortable taking. Again, if you're more of a risk taker and you're cool with it, go for it. That's none of my business. But I just want to make sure people know about the potential risks and also some options. So now let's talk about, if you aren't going to water glass eggs, what are some of the more kind of modern ways to do it? And let me say too, if, for example, the grid goes down or we have like a zombie apocalypse situation, I still have the bags of pickling lime. I printed off how to do this. If we have to go back to kind of pioneer times, I think it's not a bad thing to have in your back pocket, but these other options we're going to talk about are just way more efficient and certainly more safe. But that's not to say, hey, in an emergency situation, like a serious emergency, I don't think it's a bad thing to know. Okay, let's talk about how to preserve your eggs in a 100% food safe way. Number 1, fridge. Fridge is an awesome way to store your eggs. I actually tend to start storing my eggs in the spring because my chickens, they usually in midsummer when it gets really hot, they'll molt. And then it's actually in the summer when I have an egg shortage more than in the winter. So I will start stocking up eggs in the fridge, and I will have those eggs for 4 months, 5 months in the fridge, and they're perfectly fine. Every once in a while I might get one funky one, but that just kind of goes to show, same thing as if you were water glassing eggs, they all look really great, and for some reason one's just weird. You can never figure that out for sure. You don't know why, it just is kind of weird. But for the most part, your fridge. And fridges, I know not everybody has the ability to have like a second fridge. We do have a second fridge in our basement that ends up storing, eggs and sauerkraut and all that kind of stuff. So that might be something, if it is in kind of your future, is to look at, saving up to get just a general old school fridge or a smaller apartment size fridge. If you're really into homesteading and kind of canning and preserving and pickling and things like that, it might be a nice idea to have a backup fridge if you can. Even a dorm fridge, you can fit a lot of eggs in. I'm gonna have a video coming up pretty soon about how you can freeze eggs. It's very simple. You're just cracking them into a bowl, whisking them up, and then I like to use, I'll show you here, these sort of silicone muffin tins, because then the frozen eggs pop right out of these things like a hockey puck. It's great. And so it's something that you do want to kind of pay attention. You have to figure out, how many eggs you can get into each little puck for when it comes time for baking and things like that. Another option is to dehydrate your eggs. Now this is one where you do have to, again, pay attention to food safety things. You have to heat the eggs to a certain temperature to make sure you're killing all that bacteria. And then these are eggs that, for the most part, from what I've read, you're gonna wanna use them more for baking and things. Though I'm sure if you kind of poked around, you could figure out more of the science of it, because I know they make, like eggs in those dehydrated, or maybe those are freeze dried, those packs that like hikers and stuff use. I think those are freeze dried, which freeze drying, that's the next one to talk about, is freeze drying eggs. I do not have access to a freeze dryer, so it's not something I'm going to be doing, but it is another way that you could potentially preserve your eggs safely. Lastly, and my favorite way, I think, probably to preserve eggs is to cook them into something. It's sort of the same way that people, when you had milk back in the day and you didn't have a way to keep your milk cold and keep it lasting, you turned it into something. You made it into kefir, you made it into cheese, you made it into something that was shelf stable and still a way to use it. So I really like to use eggs and make stuff ahead. I like to do a big egg bake and then cut it into little, squares and have them in a freezer bag. And if my husband's kind of running out the door trying to get to work or something, I can pull one of those out and pop it on some toast and hand it to him. You can make, one of my absolute favorites is a flourless chocolate cake, this torte. I will link it in the description box. It uses 10 eggs and it freezes awesome. So not only can you preserve all these extra eggs that you have, but you also can do yourself a favor and do a little bit of meal prep at the same time. Again, it does require some freezer space is the only catch here, but still, I will link to a video here where I have recipes and ideas and a way to use up and eat 3 dozen eggs in one day. So there are ways you can use and preserve your eggs in ways that are 100% food safe. They're going to benefit your family, and you're not going to be stuck at the end of the day with some sort of an egg where you're kind of going, I don't know, is it worth it? Is it not? Now you got some other options. If you'd like to start a fight in the comment section, go ahead. I'm sure this is probably going to ruffle a few feathers, but again, it's a personal preference and a personal choice that I want to make. And I just think it's really important that everybody out there has the ability to make informed choices about these sort of things as well. So start swinging punches if you feel the need to. Otherwise, if you have any questions about this, please hop down to the comment section. Otherwise, we will see you here next week for more from our Rough and Tumble Farmhouse.